I think my evil ex is haunting me. When I found out my ex-boyfriend who broke 2 of my ribs and put me in a coma for a week was dying of cancer, I thought my prayers had been answered. He texted me, "You know you'll never actually get away from me." And I rolled my eyes and sent him a gif of the Grim Reaper. He died 2 days later, and my girlfriends threw me a no more restraining order party. But then things got weird. First, it was just his cologne in my apartment. That specific Dior Sauvage he always wore that now made me want to puke. I figured maybe it was coming through the vents or my brain was being dramatic because trauma does weird things to you. Then I started finding stuff moved around in ways that were so specifically him, it made my skin crawl. Coffee mug handle facing left because God forbid a right-handed person touch his special mug. My shoes lined up like soldiers by the door because apparently chaos would reign if they were even slightly crooked. The thermostat at exactly 68 degrees, which meant I was freezing my butt off under 3 blankets just like old times. I changed my locks even though he'd never had a key because breaking in was more his style anyway. I got a security camera that showed absolutely nothing except me looking increasingly paranoid, checking it every 5 minutes. My therapist said it was normal to feel weird after your abuser dies because your whole fight-or-flight system doesn't know what to do with itself anymore, which sounded logical until I woke up with his fingerprints on my wrist. Not fingerprints literally, but bruises in the exact pattern of how he used to grab me when he was pissed about something like me breathing too loud. Purple and green like they were days old even though my wrists were clear when I went to bed. I'd worn long sleeves to sleep and they weren't even pulled up or twisted or anything. I showed my friend Claire and she did that thing where she tried to look supportive while obviously thinking I'd lost it. Then his music started playing at 3 a.m. from absolutely nowhere. Not just any music, but the specific playlist he'd force me to listen to on those fun 4-hour drives where he'd scream about every single thing I'd ever done wrong, including that time I sneezed during his favorite song. I checked every device, asked the neighbors, even had the super come check the vents, but we found nothing. I could hear every word clear as day coming from inside my walls like the building itself had memorized his Spotify. I went to his funeral because I needed to see him in that box with my own eyes, and sat in the back while his mom sobbed and his friends talked about what a legend he was, nobody mentioning the 3 arrests or the 2 other girls with matching restraining orders. I asked the funeral director probably one too many questions about whether that was definitely him in the casket, and was he absolutely sure the body was dead because you hear about these things, and he looked at me like I was insane, which, fair. But things kept escalating, and I started writing everything down so I'd have proof I wasn't making this up. I opened my laptop to find a document I didn't create with, "You'll never get away from me," copied and pasted like 1,000 times. My car started itself in the closed garage at 2 a.m. and nearly killed me with carbon monoxide before the alarm went off. I came home from work to find my bathtub had overflowed with scalding water, and my landlord was ready to evict me. Ghosts aren't real, so there had to be an explanation. Maybe his psycho brother was somehow involved, but he lived in Denver and had alibis. Maybe one of his friends was carrying out some twisted revenge plot, but the cameras showed nothing and nobody had keys. Maybe he wasn't actually dead and had pulled some elaborate fake death scheme. But that's insane, even though I only saw his body from far away, and funeral makeup can cover a lot. And would anyone really check that closely? The worst possibility was that I was doing it to myself, having some kind of breakdown where I was recreating the abuse because my brain was broken from all the trauma. My therapist gently suggested inpatient psychiatric care after I showed her my journal of incidents. But that same night, invisible hands choked me awake and left scratches on my neck that couldn't be from my own fingers because I bite my nails to nothing, and these were deep, long marks from actual nails. I ran to a motel 200 miles away because I couldn't stay in that apartment another second, but woke up to find "Found You" written in the bathroom mirror steam, even though I hadn't showered, and that mirror was bone dry when I went to sleep. Maybe he was haunting me, or maybe someone was helping him posthumously, or maybe he faked his death, or maybe I was having a complete psychological meltdown. But either way, he was right about one thing. I was never getting away from him. I had to find out what was happening. Listen to 90 seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. I sat on that motel bed staring at the mirror message until my hands stopped shaking enough to think clearly. Ghosts weren't real, which meant someone real was doing this to me, and real people left real evidence. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything in that bathroom. The mirror, the dry towel rack, the bone-dry shower stall. If someone was tracking me 200 miles away, they were using actual technology, not supernatural powers, and that meant I could fight back. I packed my stuff in about 3 minutes and checked out, telling the desk clerk there was nothing wrong even though she gave me a weird look. The drive back to the city took almost 4 hours, and I spent the whole time planning what I'd say to make the police actually listen to me instead of thinking I was crazy. I had my journal with all the dates and times written down. I had photos of the bruises and scratches. I had screenshots of the threatening document on my laptop. Real evidence for a real threat, not ghost stories. I walked into the police station just after noon and asked to file a report about stalking and breaking and entering. The officer at the desk looked tired and skeptical, but he took me to a back room with a table and 2 chairs. I showed him everything while he wrote notes, watching his face stay neutral in that cop way where you can't tell what they're thinking. He asked questions about my ex being dead, and whether I was sure about that, which made me want to scream. But I stayed calm and showed him the funeral program I'd kept. He asked if I had any suspects, and I admitted I didn't know who was doing this, but someone clearly was. He asked about the visible security camera and why it didn't catch anything, and I explained that whoever was doing this obviously knew where it was. He asked if I'd considered that I might be experiencing trauma-related symptoms, and I pulled up my sleeves to show him the bruises that were still fading. He took pictures of everything with his phone and said someone would follow up, which sounded like cop speak for nothing. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective named Sebastian Gibson, who wanted to meet at a coffee shop near the station. He showed up in regular clothes, not a uniform, and he was direct about the whole situation being complicated. He told me that without a clear suspect or physical proof of someone breaking in, his resources were really limited. But then he said something that made me want to cry, which was that he believed something was happening to me, and he'd do what he could to help. He asked detailed questions about my ex's friends and family, about who had keys to my apartment, about my daily routines, and whether I'd noticed anyone following me. He wrote everything down in an actual notebook, not just his phone, and he gave me his direct number for emergencies. He said to call him immediately if anything else happened, not to wait or second-guess myself. Having someone official actually take me seriously felt like the first piece of solid ground I'd stood on in weeks. That same afternoon, I called a domestic violence advocacy center that Sebastian had mentioned. The woman who answered transferred me to someone named Cecilia Mercer, who had an opening that day if I could come in. I drove straight there and found a small office in a building that looked like it tried to be welcoming without being obvious about what it was for. Cecilia was maybe 40 with kind eyes, and she didn't waste time on small talk. She asked me to tell her what was happening, and I went through the whole thing again, expecting her to look doubtful like everyone else. But she just nodded and took notes and asked practical questions about my safety right now. She didn't question whether the incidents were real or suggest I was imagining things. She just focused on keeping me safe, which was exactly what I needed. We talked for almost 2 hours, and by the end, I felt like I had someone in my corner who actually understood how abusive relationships work. Cecilia helped me create what she called a safety plan, which was basically a detailed strategy for making myself harder to track and hurt. We went through my daily routines and figured out ways to vary them so I wasn't predictable. We established code words I could text to Claire and other friends if I felt unsafe but couldn't talk openly. We set up a system for documenting every single incident with photos, times, and detailed notes. She explained that stalkers often get worse when their victims try to escape, and my ex dying might have triggered someone else to continue his control over me. That thought made me sick, but it also made sense in a horrible way. She gave me a folder full of resources and phone numbers and made me promise to check in with her twice a week. Having a concrete plan made the fear feel slightly more manageable, like I was doing something instead of just being hunted. Over the next few days, I upgraded my security setup with cameras that weren't obvious like the first one had been. I ordered tiny cameras that could hide in normal objects and stream directly to cloud storage, so nobody could erase the footage. I set up motion sensors that would alert my phone if anything moved in my apartment when I wasn't there. The visible camera had obviously been a decoy that whoever was doing this knew to avoid, so now I was setting traps they wouldn't see coming. I spent hours placing everything perfectly, testing the angles, making sure I had coverage of every entry point and every room. It felt good to be taking action, to be strategic instead of just scared. If someone came into my apartment again, I'd have proof that couldn't be explained away. I also ordered a tracking device detector online and spent an entire afternoon sweeping my car and apartment. I checked every surface and crevice, running the detector slowly over seats and under dashboards and along baseboards. I moved furniture and checked behind picture frames and unscrewed vent covers. The detector stayed silent the whole time, which was somehow more frustrating than if I'd found something. I knew someone was monitoring my movements because they'd found me at that motel 200 miles away. But I couldn't find any obvious tracking devices, which meant either they were using something more sophisticated or they had access to my phone or accounts. The not knowing made my skin crawl, but at least I'd eliminated the simple explanations. Cecilia recommended I talk to a cyberstalking specialist named Raymond Carver, who could audit my devices for spyware or remote access. I met him the next day at a coffee shop, and he looked exactly like you'd expect a tech security guy to look, which was tired and skeptical of everything. I explained what was happening, and he asked to see my laptop and phone. I handed them over feeling weirdly exposed, like I was giving a stranger access to my whole life. He said he'd need a few days to run a thorough audit and check for any unauthorized access or monitoring software. He gave me a burner phone to use temporarily and told me not to log into any of my accounts from any device until he finished checking. Walking out of that coffee shop without my phone felt like losing a limb, but if it helped me figure out what was happening, it was worth it. 3 days later, Raymond called me on the burner phone with news that made my stomach drop and my head clear at the same time. He'd found remote access software on both my laptop and phone that had been installed weeks ago, probably before my ex even died. He'd also found traces of someone logging into my email, social media, and cloud storage accounts using old passwords I'd shared with my ex years ago and never changed. Whoever was doing this had been watching everything I did online, reading my messages, seeing my location data, accessing my calendar and photos. The violation made me want to throw up, but it also meant I wasn't crazy or imagining things. This was real, it was documented, and now I had technical proof that someone was stalking me through my devices. Raymond said he'd write up a detailed report with all the evidence and I should forward it to the detective immediately. I sent Sebastian the technical report the same day, and he called me back within an hour. He said this gave him something concrete to investigate, which meant he could assign more priority to my case and start pulling records. He explained that he'd request logs from my account providers showing IP addresses and login locations, which might help identify who was accessing my accounts. He said the remote access software was sophisticated enough that this was clearly planned and deliberate, not just someone guessing my passwords. He asked if I was somewhere safe, and I told him I was staying with Claire for a few days while we figured this out. He said that was smart and to keep documenting everything and that he'd update me as soon as he had more information. Hanging up that call, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was building a case, gathering evidence, and whoever was doing this to me was about to find out that I wasn't going to disappear quietly like they wanted. I spent that night at Claire's making lists on my laptop of everyone who'd been in my ex's life and might know enough about me to pull this off. His mom lived 3 states away and barely left her house according to Facebook, so probably not her. His brother in Denver had alibis for half the incidents based on his work schedule I found online. His gym buddies were possibilities, but none of them knew where I lived or had access to my routines. Then I kept coming back to Annie Maloney, his best friend who'd posted this long tribute after he died about how he was misunderstood, and the legal system destroyed good men. She'd shown up at the courthouse during one of my restraining order hearings and stared at me like I'd murdered her dog. She knew our apartment, knew his habits, knew how he liked things arranged. I added 3 stars next to her name and kept digging through her social media, looking for anything that might connect her to the incidents. The next morning, I met Cecilia at the advocacy center and showed her everything Raymond had found plus my suspect list. She said we should file for a protection order even without knowing for sure who was doing this, because having legal standing would help once we identified them. We spent 2 hours filling out forms documenting every incident with dates and times, attaching Raymond's technical report and photos of the bruises and scratches. The judge reviewed everything that afternoon and granted a temporary order against unknown persons engaged in stalking and harassment, though Cecilia explained we couldn't serve it until we had a name. Walking out of that courthouse with legal paperwork felt like I'd armed myself with something real instead of just fear and confusion. My boss called me that same evening asking why I'd missed another shift, and I had to go into her office the next day expecting to get fired. I sat across from her desk trying not to cry while I explained that someone was stalking me, that I had police reports and court orders, that I was staying at a friend's place because my apartment wasn't safe. She listened without interrupting, and then surprised me by saying the company had policies for this kind of thing. We worked out a temporary schedule with fewer hours and more flexibility so I could keep my job while dealing with everything. Leaving her office, I felt this weird gratitude mixed with shame that I needed accommodations at all, but at least I wouldn't lose my income on top of everything else. 2 weeks crawled by while I checked my hidden camera feeds obsessively from Claire's couch, watching nothing happen night after night. Then at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, my phone buzzed with a motion alert and I nearly dropped it pulling up the live feed. A figure in dark clothes and a hoodie moved through my apartment like they owned the place, and my hands shook so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. They went straight to the thermostat and adjusted it, then lined up my shoes by the door in that perfect military row, then turned my coffee mug handle to face left. I was watching someone recreate my ex's control patterns in real time, and the footage was capturing every second. I called Sebastian immediately, even though it was the middle of the night, and he told me to save everything and not go back to the apartment. Raymond called me the next morning after I forwarded him the footage timestamp, and he said he'd found login activity from a device near my building at 3 a.m. that matched the camera timing. He couldn't identify who owned the device yet, but the pattern showed someone physically close who'd been planning these incidents carefully over weeks. The technical evidence was piling up, but we still needed a face and a name. Sebastian called that afternoon with an idea that made my stomach hurt. He wanted me to establish a predictable absence so we could lure the intruder back while cameras rolled and he positioned nearby to catch them. Using myself as bait felt wrong on every level, but I was so tired of being scared and I needed this to end. I told him I'd do it. The next day I met Raymond at a parking lot because he'd told me to check my car again with a better tracker detector he was lending me. I crawled around my car in broad daylight, not caring who saw me, running this wand thing under every panel and wheel well. It beeped under my rear bumper and I found a tiny black device taped up inside, smaller than my thumb. I had to sit there in the parking lot breathing through waves of rage that someone had been tracking my every movement for who knows how long. Sebastian told me to leave it in place when I called him, that we needed to document the pattern and build a stronger case before removing evidence. Every part of me wanted to rip that thing off and smash it into pieces, but I forced myself to think like a prosecutor instead of a victim. Cecilia spent our next session coaching me on how to testify if this went to court. warning me that defense attorneys would question my credibility and suggest I was unstable. We practiced staying calm and factual, focusing on the documented evidence instead of my emotional reactions. She made me repeat my answers until I could say them without my voice shaking or my hands clenching. Christopher Phillips left me a voicemail that same week demanding I come to his office about the water damage from the bathtub incident. I sat across from him trying not to break down while he threatened eviction and talked about his property values. I explained that police were investigating criminal trespass, and I was the victim of ongoing harassment, not some problem tenant who'd flooded the bathroom on purpose. He backed off slightly when I mentioned the police report number, but I could tell he still blamed me for the whole situation. Raymond called me 2 days later and told me to sit down before he shared what he found. My ex's Spotify account was still active and someone was streaming from a device that got added after he died. I stared at my phone trying to process what that meant, while Raymond explained that whoever was doing this had his login info and was using his actual account to play that music through my walls. The sick part was how planned it all seemed, like someone studied exactly how he used to control me and decided to keep doing it for him. I felt my hands start shaking because this confirmed someone real was behind everything, but it also meant they were twisted enough to access a dead man's accounts just to mess with my head. Raymond said he was documenting the device info and login times to build a timeline of when the harassment happened. I thanked him and sat in my car for 20 minutes just breathing, because knowing it was human somehow made it worse than thinking I was losing my mind. I found out through some online searching that Annie Maloney was hosting a memorial gathering for my ex that weekend at a community center. I bought a baseball cap and cheap sunglasses and showed up looking nothing like myself, standing in the back corner where nobody would notice me. Annie stood at the front of the room talking about what an amazing person he was, how he always helped his friends, how the world lost someone special. I watched her touch his jacket that someone had draped over a chair, running her fingers over the fabric like it was sacred. She kept picking up items that belonged to him, a coffee mug, his favorite book, holding them carefully and setting them down in specific spots. The way she arranged everything reminded me of how my apartment kept getting organized in his patterns. She looked at his photos with this intense focus that made my skin crawl, like she was memorizing every detail. I left before anyone could recognize me, but I'd seen enough to know Annie wasn't just grieving. She was obsessed. Sebastian spent the next few days canvassing my apartment building with photos of Annie that I'd pulled from her social media. Most neighbors said they hadn't seen anything, but then he knocked on the door of someone on the 3rd floor. The neighbor remembered seeing a woman with short dark hair hanging around the stairwell late at night several times over the past month. Sebastian showed her Annie's photo and she nodded, said that looked like the same person. The detail that made me feel sick was when the neighbor mentioned the woman was wearing really strong cologne, the expensive kind that smelled masculine, my ex's cologne. Annie had been in my building multiple times wearing his scent like some kind of twisted tribute, and I hadn't even known she was there. Sebastian documented everything in his report and told me this was solid evidence that someone specific was targeting me with access to the building. I had to go back to HR the following week to make my reduced hours official and explain why I needed workplace accommodations. Sitting across from the HR rep, I laid out the situation as calmly as I could, talking about ongoing safety concerns and active police investigation. They listened without judging and said they'd document everything formally and adjust my schedule to give me flexibility for court dates and meetings with police. Having it all official in my employee file made me feel less like I was failing at my job and more like I was handling a crisis the right way. The HR rep told me to let them know immediately if anyone showed up at work looking for me or if I felt unsafe. I left that meeting feeling like at least one part of my life was stable, and people believed me. The court hearing for my temporary protection order happened on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in the waiting area with my folder of evidence. When my case got called, I presented everything to the judge: the camera footage, the tracker, Raymond's technical reports, Sebastian's witness statements. The judge reviewed it all carefully and granted the temporary order, saying the pattern of harassment was clear and concerning. Sebastian got approval to serve it once we identified the harasser for certain, which meant we were close to making this official. Walking out of the courthouse with that legal paper in my hands didn't make me feel safer yet, but it was something concrete, proof that the system was taking this seriously. I called Cecilia on my way home and she reminded me this was progress, that legal protection matters even when it doesn't feel like enough. Sebastian and I planned the first bait night for that Friday, with me staying at Hope Butler's apartment while my covert cameras ran live and he parked in an unmarked car nearby. Hope made up her couch for me and told me to try to sleep, but I couldn't stop watching the camera feeds on my phone. I sat there in the dark, scrolling between different camera angles, waiting for any movement in my apartment. The hours dragged and I started wondering if whoever was doing this somehow knew it was a trap. My eyes hurt from staring at the screen and my neck was stiff from hunching over my phone, but I couldn't look away because I needed to see who was violating my space. Just after 2 a.m., a figure appeared on my camera feed and I grabbed my phone so hard my hands cramped. I watched in real time as someone in a dark hoodie and baseball cap moved through my apartment, and the way they walked was familiar, confident, like they'd done this 100 times. They went straight to the thermostat first and adjusted it, then moved to my shoes and lined them up by the door. When they reached for my coffee mug, they pulled back their sleeve slightly and the camera caught their wrist. There was a tattoo there, some kind of small design, and I zoomed in on my phone screen trying to see it clearly. I'd seen that exact tattoo in one of Annie's memorial photos when she was holding my ex's jacket, her sleeve pushed up and that same mark visible on her wrist. I took screenshots of everything and immediately texted Sebastian and Raymond. Raymond got back to me by morning with something that made the whole picture snap into focus. He'd been tracking Annie Maloney's social media posts and found gaps in her location tags that lined up perfectly with every incident I'd documented. She posted a selfie from a bar across town at midnight, but my cameras caught her in my apartment at 2 a.m., and there was no way she could explain being in two places. He'd built a spreadsheet comparing her online activity with my incident log, and the pattern was undeniable. Every time something happened to me, Annie's social media went quiet or showed inconsistent location data. Sebastian called me right after and said this was enough to move forward, that between the cameras, the technical evidence, and the witness statement, we had a solid case against Annie Maloney. I drove to the funeral home the next day because I needed to see proof with my own eyes that my ex was actually dead. The funeral director looked at me weird when I walked in and asked for copies of all the paperwork related to my ex's death and cremation. He asked why I needed it, and I just said it was for legal purposes, which wasn't exactly a lie. He went into the back office and came out with certified copies of the death certificate, the cremation authorization, and the medical examiner's report. I paid for the copies and sat in my car reading through every page, checking dates and signatures and official seals. Reading those documents brought this strange feeling that was part relief and part anger mixing together in my chest. The death certificate had the medical examiner's signature and the official seal, and the cause of death listed as cancer, which meant he really was gone. He wasn't faking it, wasn't hiding somewhere planning to come back. He was actually dead and cremated and never coming back. But someone who loved him enough to worship his memory was trying to continue torturing me, and that felt even more sick than if he'd somehow faked his death. Annie had turned her grief into a mission to carry out his threats, to make sure I never got away from him even after he died. I sat there holding those papers and realized the haunting was real, just not supernatural. It was a living person who couldn't let go of a dead abuser's control. 2 days later, I opened my laptop to find my personal address posted on 3 different local message boards, with comments calling me a liar who destroyed a good man. My work email got flooded with anonymous messages saying things like, "Finish what he started and you deserve everything coming to you," each one making my hands shake worse than the last one. I forwarded everything to Raymond and Sebastian immediately, copying the headers and screenshots like they taught me. Raymond called me that same afternoon and told me to stop opening the emails, that he needed to preserve the digital evidence exactly as it came in. He walked me through setting up filters that would save everything to a separate folder, without me having to read the threats, which helped me breathe a little easier. 3 days later, Raymond sent me a report showing he'd traced the email headers and found a mistake in whoever was sending them. They were using a VPN to hide their location, but one of the emails had a leak that pinged to an IP address near Annie's workplace downtown. He explained how the technical evidence was piling up, connecting Annie to both breaking into my apartment and running the whole digital harassment thing. I met with Cecilia the next day to go over safety plans, because the doxing meant anyone could find me now. She had me write down my daily routine, and then we went through changing everything. I started taking 3 different routes to work depending on the day, never the same pattern twice in a row. Claire agreed to be my grocery store buddy so I wouldn't go to public places alone. Hope said she'd walk me to my car after work shifts. We set up code words that meant I need help right now without actually saying it. Like if I texted the word coffee to either of them, they'd call the police to my location. Living this way felt crazy and paranoid, but Cecilia kept reminding me that I wasn't being paranoid when someone was actually stalking me. Sebastian called me into the station during week 5 of building evidence and said he was ready to request a search warrant. He'd put together everything we had, which was the camera footage, Raymond's digital traces showing the remote access and email harassment, the neighbor's statement about seeing someone in the stairwell, and the GPS tracker we'd left in place to document the pattern. The judge would need to see that we had probable cause to search Annie's apartment and seize her devices. I sat in Sebastian's office while he typed up the warrant request, laying out 6 weeks of documented incidents in careful legal language. He submitted it to the judge that afternoon and told me it usually took a few days to get approval. I spent those next few days at Cecilia's office practicing my impact statement in case this went to trial. She had me write out what happened in the most factual way possible, stripping out the emotional words that would make me sound unstable. We practiced me saying I woke up to hands around my throat and discovered scratches on my neck instead of invisible hands choked me and left marks. I had to describe the fear without sounding scared, the violation without sounding like a victim, the whole nightmare without sounding like I was having a breakdown. Cecilia recorded me on her phone so I could watch myself and see where I started crying or where my voice got too high and panicked. By the 3rd practice session, I could get through the whole thing in a steady voice, sticking to facts and evidence instead of feelings. The judge approved the search warrant on a Friday, and Sebastian called to say we were setting up another bait night for Monday. This time we used the exact same pattern as before, with me staying at Hope's apartment and my lights on timers to show I was gone. I sat on Hope's couch with my phone showing the camera feeds, watching my empty apartment and waiting. Annie showed up at 2:30 in the morning, later than last time but following her same routine. She let herself in with those bump keys, moved straight to the thermostat, then lined up my shoes by the door. When she reached for my coffee mug, she paused and looked around like maybe she sensed something was different. Then she pulled off her hood to wipe sweat from her face, and the camera caught her full face in perfect clarity. No shadows or angles to hide behind. I took screenshots immediately and texted them to Sebastian, who was parked 3 blocks away. He responded that he had what he needed, and I should stay at Hope's for the rest of the night. Sebastian spent the next 2 days running the clear footage through facial recognition and matching it against Annie's driver's license photo and her social media pictures. He sent me a comparison image showing Annie's face from the camera next to her Facebook profile photo. The same nose and chin and eyebrows, completely undeniable. He told me he was moving forward with executing the search warrant, and I should prepare myself for things to get intense. Tuesday morning came, and I sat in the police station with Cecilia, while Sebastian and 3 other officers went to Annie's apartment with the warrant. My phone buzzed with updates every 20 minutes. They're inside. They found devices. They're seizing evidence. They're photographing everything. 2 hours later, Sebastian came back to the station carrying boxes of evidence bags, and his face told me they'd hit the target. They'd seized Annie's laptop and phone and tablet, 3 bottles of Dior Sauvage cologne, a set of bump keys for picking locks, some kind of relay device for starting cars remotely, and the packaging from the GPS tracker that matched the serial number on the one under my car. Sebastian laid it all out on a table in the evidence room, and I stared at the physical proof that this was real, that someone had bought these things specifically to torture me. Annie got arrested that same afternoon, and I stood at the station window watching them bring her in. She looked smaller than I expected, this regular-sized woman in a hoodie and jeans instead of the huge monster I'd built up in my head. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, and she was crying, which made me feel weird because I'd imagined her as cold and calculating, but she just looked pathetic and sad. Sebastian charged her with stalking, breaking and entering, attempted assault for the choking incident, and cyberstalking for the email campaign and remote access stuff. He told me she'd be arraigned tomorrow and I could attend if I wanted to see the formal charges read. The next day, Sebastian interviewed Annie with her public defender sitting right there, and I watched through the two-way glass as she completely fell apart. She kept crying and saying my ex was a good man who I'd destroyed with lies and false accusations. She said after he died, she felt like someone needed to make me pay for what I'd done to him, to make me suffer the way she thought he'd suffered. She admitted to everything, including breaking in at night, moving things around to mess with my head, using his cologne to make me think he was haunting me, remotely starting my car, and overflowing my bathtub, accessing my accounts with his old passwords and sending all the threatening emails. Her lawyer kept trying to get her to stop talking, but she just kept going, like she needed everyone to understand that she was doing this for him, carrying out what she saw as justice for a man she'd loved who couldn't hurt me anymore himself. Sebastian called me 2 days later with the forensics report, and his voice had that satisfied edge that meant good news. The tech team pulled everything off Annie's seized devices, and it was all there, every single piece of the puzzle connecting back to her. They found the remote access software she'd installed on my laptop and phone using my ex's old passwords, the Spotify account logins for casting his playlist to my apartment at 3 a.m., the drafts of threatening emails she'd sent from burner accounts. Raymond's documentation matched perfectly with the timestamps on her devices, showing she'd been accessing my accounts and cameras for months. They even found search history for how to pick locks with bump keys, how to trigger car ignitions remotely, how to make someone think they're losing their mind. Sebastian told me the prosecutor was calling it one of the most thoroughly documented stalking cases he'd ever seen, which felt weird to be proud of, but I was proud anyway. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no way Annie could claim this was a misunderstanding or coincidence. The court hearing for my protection order happened the following week, and this time it wasn't temporary. The judge reviewed the police reports, the forensics evidence, the confession transcript, and extended the order for a full year with Annie Maloney named specifically. Sebastian explained the terms to me afterwards, going through each clause carefully so I understood exactly what was protected. No physical proximity within 500 feet, no phone calls or text messages, no emails or social media contact, no third-party contact through friends or family. If she violated any part of it, she'd be arrested immediately and face additional charges. The order would stay active for at least a year, and I could petition to extend it after that if I still felt unsafe. Having her name on an official court document instead of just unknown harasser made it feel real in a way I hadn't expected. Christopher Phillips called me the same day I got home from court, and I braced myself for another eviction threat. Instead, he apologized, actually used the word sorry, and told me Sebastian had sent him a letter explaining the apartment damages were caused by criminal trespass. He said he should have taken my concerns more seriously when I first reported the incidents, and he was dropping any eviction proceedings. I accepted his apology because what else was I going to do? But the whole conversation felt surreal after weeks of him treating me like a problem tenant. He even offered to change my locks again at no charge and install a deadbolt, which was nice, but also way too late to make me feel safe there. I told Cecilia the next day that I wanted to move anyway, because that apartment would never feel like home again. Every room had memories of finding things moved or waking up to attacks or discovering new violations of my space. She understood immediately and helped me apply for emergency relocation funds through the DV Advocacy Center, filling out forms that documented the stalking campaign and explained why staying there would harm my recovery. The application asked for details about the harassment, and I had pages of documentation to attach, which made the process easier, but also meant reliving everything again. Cecilia said the funds usually took a few weeks to process, but my case was strong because of the criminal charges and protection order. Living somewhere Annie had never accessed felt essential, like I couldn't actually start healing until I was in a space she hadn't contaminated. Raymond met me at a coffee shop the following Tuesday to rebuild my digital security from the ground up. He brought a notebook full of instructions and spent 3 hours walking me through everything. We created unique passwords for every single account using a password manager, set up hardware authentication keys that required physical devices to log in, and established compartmentalized email addresses for different purposes. He showed me how to check for unauthorized access attempts, how to recognize phishing emails that might try to steal my credentials, how to use two-factor authentication properly. He made me practice the security steps until I could do them without his help, and he set up monthly check-ins to make sure I was maintaining the protections. Having an expert I trusted monitoring my digital safety made me feel like I could use my laptop and phone again without constant paranoia. Sebastian called me a week later with news I'd been dreading. Annie's public defender was pushing hard for a plea deal to avoid trial, arguing that she had no prior criminal record and was suffering from complicated grief over my ex's death. The prosecutor was considering it because trials are expensive and time-consuming, and the evidence was so strong that Annie would probably plead guilty to something. Sebastian was honest that the charges might get reduced, maybe dropping the attempted assault or combining the cyberstalking counts, and the sentence might be lighter than what I wanted. He told me the system often disappoints victims, and he was sorry he couldn't promise me perfect justice. But he also said the evidence was strong enough that Annie would face real consequences either way, whether that was jail time or probation or both. I appreciated his honesty, even though it made me angry that she might get a deal after putting me through months of terror. I scheduled a session with Alice Rutledge focused specifically on integrating what I now knew with what I'd experienced. We worked on distinguishing between real threats and trauma triggers, rebuilding my ability to trust my own perceptions after weeks of gaslighting. She helped me understand that my instincts had been right all along, that I wasn't crazy or paranoid, that someone really was violating my space and safety. We practiced identifying the difference between justified fear, based on actual danger and anxiety responses left over from the abuse. She taught me grounding techniques for when my body reacted to triggers even though my brain knew I was safe. The session helped me feel less broken, like maybe I could learn to trust myself again even after someone had deliberately tried to destroy that trust. I went back to work the following Monday with a formal safety plan on file that HR had helped me create. The plan included security escorts to my car at the end of shifts, code phrases I could use to alert management if I felt unsafe, and permission to work from home on days when my anxiety was too high. My coworkers knew something serious had happened, but nobody pushed me for details, which I appreciated more than the people who wanted the whole story. They were supportive without being intrusive, treating me normally while also respecting that I needed some accommodations. Getting back into my work routine helped me feel like a regular person again, instead of just a victim dealing with legal proceedings. Cecilia invited me to speak at the DV support group she ran, and I spent a week preparing copies of my documentation to share privately. I organized the incident logs, the forensics reports, the timeline of harassment, and the security measures that had helped build the case. Other survivors needed to know that stalking can continue through proxies after an abuser dies, that systematic documentation really does help build cases, that the system sometimes works if you have enough evidence. I wasn't ready to speak publicly yet, but I could share my records with people who might benefit from seeing how I'd tracked everything. Cecilia said several group members had experienced ongoing harassment after their abusers died or went to prison, and my case might help them understand they weren't imagining things. The prosecutor scheduled a plea hearing for 3 weeks out and added cyberstalking enhancement charges based on Raymond's detailed technical logs. Annie's lawyer argued for leniency at the preliminary hearing, claiming she was a grieving friend who made terrible choices, but the prosecutor pushed back hard. He cited the sustained campaign over months, the multiple methods of harassment, the physical danger of the car incident and the choking attack, and the fact that my ex had multiple victims with restraining orders which proved a pattern. The judge seemed unimpressed with the grief defense and set the plea hearing date, warning Annie's lawyer that the evidence supported serious charges regardless of her emotional state. I left the courthouse feeling like maybe the system was actually taking this seriously, like maybe Annie would face real consequences for trying to finish what my ex had started. I started apartment hunting the next week because staying in that building felt impossible even with Annie arrested. Cecilia gave me a list of places with actual security, and I toured 5 buildings before finding one that felt right. The manager showed me a 2-bedroom unit on the 4th floor with key fob entry at every door and cameras covering all the common areas. I walked through each room, checking the windows and testing the locks, while she explained the building had overnight security and required background checks for all residents. The 2nd bedroom meant Claire could stay over when I needed company without us cramping each other on a couch. I filled out the application right there and paid the deposit with money I'd been saving for a vacation I never took. The manager called 2 days later to say I was approved, and we scheduled the lease signing for that Friday. Sitting in her office with the pen in my hand felt like the first real choice I'd made in months, instead of just reacting to whatever nightmare came next. I signed every page and got my keys and walked through the empty apartment, running my hands along walls that nobody had ever violated. Moving day happened 3 weeks later, with Claire, Hope, and Cecilia showing up with boxes and packing tape. We loaded my stuff systematically, and I threw away anything that felt contaminated by the old apartment. The coffee mug with the handle that had to face left went straight in the trash. The thermostat I'd fought with for months stayed on the wall for the next tenant. We hauled boxes up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken, and I didn't even care because this was my place that Annie had never touched. Claire organized my kitchen while Hope assembled my bed frame, and Cecilia helped me set up a mail forwarding system through a P.O. box 2 neighborhoods over. I gave my new address only to the 3 of them, plus Sebastian and Alice, and told everyone else to use the P.O. box. We ordered pizza for dinner and sat on my empty living room floor eating off paper plates, and I felt almost normal for the first time since this whole thing started. They left around 9, and I locked the door behind them with my new keys and stood in the silence of my clean apartment. The plea hearing got scheduled for 2 weeks after I moved in, and I sat in the courtroom with Cecilia while the prosecutor laid out the charges. Annie stood next to her lawyer, looking small and sad, and nothing like the monster who'd choked me awake. The prosecutor detailed every incident with dates and evidence while Annie stared at the floor. Her lawyer tried arguing she was a grieving friend who made terrible choices, but the judge cut him off and asked if Annie understood the seriousness of stalking and breaking and entering and cyberstalking. Annie said yes in a voice so quiet I barely heard it. The judge accepted her guilty plea and sentenced her to 3 years probation, with conditions that included monitored devices and mandatory mental health treatment and absolute no-contact orders. She had to check in with a probation officer twice a month, and any violations would mean immediate jail time. The judge looked directly at me when he confirmed the protection order would stay active, and told Annie that stalking survivors deserve to feel safe in their own homes. We walked out of the courthouse, and I felt this weird mix of relief and disappointment, because part of me wanted to face her and tell her exactly what she'd done to me. Cecilia bought me coffee at the shop across the street, and we sat by the window watching people walk past. She reminded me that protecting my mental health mattered more than perfect justice, and that I'd done everything right by documenting and reporting. I told her I kept thinking about how I'd wanted to testify and make Annie hear what those months were like. Cecilia said healing wasn't about confronting abusers. It was about building a life where they couldn't reach me anymore. We talked about safety planning for the next few months while Annie adjusted to probation, and I promised to keep checking in weekly. She walked me to my car and waited while I checked the back seat and under the vehicle before getting in. Sebastian called that evening to do final check-ins about my case. He confirmed my protection order was active in the system, and my new address was confidential in all police records. He gave me his direct contact information and told me to call immediately if Annie violated any conditions or if I felt unsafe for any reason. He said I'd done everything right by documenting every incident and trusting my instincts even when other people doubted me. That validation from someone who dealt with cases like mine every day helped quiet the voice in my head that kept saying I'd overreacted or imagined things. We went through my safety plan one more time, and he reminded me that probation violations were taken seriously, and Annie would face real consequences if she tried anything. I spent the next few days introducing myself to neighbors without giving them my whole story. I knocked on doors and explained I had a protection order against someone and asked them not to give out information about me to anyone. Most people were understanding and promised to let me know if anyone came around asking questions. The building manager flagged my unit in her system for extra security attention and gave me her cell number for emergencies. She said the overnight security guard would do extra checks on my floor, and the camera footage was stored for 90 days if we ever needed it. Having these protections felt strange after months of being completely exposed, but I was learning to accept help instead of trying to handle everything alone. Alice and I met for therapy that week and worked on developing an ongoing treatment plan. She explained we'd focus on rebuilding trust in my own judgment since the stalking campaign was designed specifically to make me doubt reality. We'd process both the original abuse from my ex and Annie's harassment as separate but connected traumas. She taught me techniques for recognizing when my anxiety was responding to real danger versus old triggers that didn't match my current situation. I told her about sleeping better in the new apartment, and she said that safety was the foundation for all other healing. We scheduled weekly sessions for the next 3 months with the option to reduce frequency once I felt more stable. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and some days would be harder than others, but I was making real progress by taking action instead of staying frozen. Raymond emailed to set up monthly device security audits going forward. He'd check my accounts for any unauthorized access and update my protections as new threats emerged. Having an expert I trusted monitoring my digital safety meant I could use my laptop and phone again without constant paranoia. He walked me through the security measures he'd implemented and explained how to recognize signs of compromise. I asked him how long I needed to keep doing these audits, and he said at least a year to make sure Annie wasn't finding ways around her monitored devices. The monthly check-ins became part of my routine like therapy and grocery shopping. Just another thing I did to keep myself safe. 3 weeks into living in my new apartment, I woke up naturally at 7 in the morning, instead of jolting awake at 3 expecting hands around my throat. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling and realized I'd slept through the entire night without panic attacks or nightmares. The absence of fear felt like a miracle after months of dreading bedtime. My space was mine, my locks were mine, and nobody had ever had access to violate it. I got up and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window watching the sunrise and feeling something close to peace. Cecilia called a few days later to invite me to speak at a DV advocacy training session about stalking by proxy. She said other advocates needed to understand how abuse could continue through third parties after the original abuser died, and that my case demonstrated the importance of believing survivors, even when their stories seemed impossible. I agreed because sharing my experience might help other people recognize these patterns and get help sooner than I did. We scheduled it for next month to give me time to prepare what I wanted to say. She reminded me I didn't have to share every detail, just enough to help professionals understand what to look for and how to support survivors dealing with similar situations. Claire came over a few days after the advocacy training invitation, and we sat on my couch drinking tea while she twisted her hands together and told me she was sorry for doubting me when everything started. I told her I got it because I doubted myself too, wondering if I was losing my mind or making things up, and that her skepticism made sense when the alternative was believing someone was orchestrating elaborate harassment from beyond the grave. She said she kept thinking about how she almost let our friendship fall apart because she couldn't wrap her head around what was happening, and now she understood that supporting someone meant trusting them, even when their reality seemed impossible. We hugged and cried a little and then ordered pizza like we used to before my life turned into a horror movie, and it felt good to have my friend back without that wall of doubt between us. The prosecutor's office sent me a letter 2 weeks later that I opened standing in my kitchen. Reading the official language that confirmed Annie's probation terms, included quarterly compliance checks with monitored devices, and any violations would result in immediate jail time. The system wasn't perfect, and I knew plenty of stalkers violated orders and got away with it, but these protections were real and enforceable, and someone was actually watching to make sure Annie stayed away from me. I stuck the letter in my growing file of legal documents that proved this whole nightmare had been real and documented and taken seriously by people with the power to do something about it. My work performance started improving as my anxiety decreased, and I could actually focus on my job instead of jumping at every notification or checking my locks between tasks. My boss pulled me aside after a meeting and mentioned she was impressed by how I'd handled everything, maintaining professionalism even while dealing with a criminal stalking case. I felt proud that I didn't let this destroy my career even though there were moments I thought it would. Times I almost quit because showing up felt impossible when I couldn't trust my own apartment. Cecilia invited me to a support group for stalking survivors that she ran every other Thursday evening, and I went to the first session nervous about sharing my story with strangers. Hearing other people describe their experiences helped me feel less alone because they understood the specific terror of being hunted by someone who knew your routines and vulnerabilities. I shared what worked for me with documentation, and bringing in specialists like Raymond and Sebastian and others shared strategies that helped me too, like varying routes and using code words with trusted people. One woman talked about her ex hiring a private investigator to track her across 3 states, and another described her coworker installing cameras in her home, and I realized stalking took so many forms, but the core violation was always the same. 6 months after Annie's arrest, I was walking to my car after work and realized I'd gone weeks without checking over my shoulder constantly or testing my locks multiple times before bed. The hypervigilance was fading gradually, replaced by reasonable caution instead of consuming fear that poisoned every moment. I still locked my doors and checked my security cameras, but it felt like normal safety precautions instead of desperate attempts to survive. I could sleep through most nights now without panic attacks jerking me awake at 3 a.m. expecting hands around my throat. Claire introduced me to someone at a birthday party, a friend of her boyfriend who seemed nice and didn't push when I was quiet or weird about personal questions. We started dating slowly after I was honest about my past and why I needed to take things at my own pace. And he was patient and respectful of my boundaries in ways that felt foreign after years with someone who used intimacy as a weapon. I was learning that not everyone saw relationships as battlegrounds for control, that some people actually listened when you said no or asked for space. Raymond did his monthly security audit and called to confirm all my accounts showed clean activity logs with no unauthorized access attempts since we'd locked everything down. Annie's monitored devices hadn't tried to contact me, and the digital harassment had completely stopped, which meant the probation monitoring was working. He reminded me to keep my passwords rotated and my authentication keys secure, but said I was doing everything right and could relax a little knowing the protections were holding. I celebrated 1 year in my new apartment by having Claire, Hope, Cecilia, and a few other friends over for dinner, cooking too much food and laughing at stories that had nothing to do with stalking or abuse. Looking around at people who supported me through the worst time of my life, I felt genuinely grateful and safe in ways I didn't know were possible 6 months ago. Hope brought wine, and Cecilia brought flowers, and Claire brought the embarrassing photos from college that made everyone laugh until we cried. The apartment felt like mine in a way my old place never had, filled with people I chose and moments I controlled and safety I'd built through documentation and strategy and refusing to doubt my own reality. I finally understood that what happened wasn't supernatural or my imagination. It was just another form of abuse designed to make me doubt reality and feel powerless. But I trusted my instincts even when everyone suggested I was losing it, built my evidence even when it seemed pointless, and found people who believed me even when my story sounded impossible. That's how I took my life back from someone who thought they could control me even from the grave, by refusing to accept that his death meant I had to keep suffering. All right, hope that made sense and gave you what you needed. If you found it useful, hit the like button so more people can find it too. Subscribe if you want more practical breakdowns like this. Thanks for watching.